Have you ever had the feeling that someone is always watching you? For the protagonist, she thought her neighbors were just background characters until she realized that they had been watching her much closer than she ever noticed. She brushed off the first incident because she assumed that the mysterious figure must have had a good reason to be watching her. But the strange incidents continued and became increasingly creepy, making her question whether she was truly alone in her home. It was a Saturday afternoon, and she was relaxing in her home when she heard the familiar creaking of the floorboards above her apartment. It wasn't anything new. The old building had always been a bit noisy, but this time it was different. The sound was slow and deliberate. As it got louder, her blood ran cold. She was sure that she wasn't imagining it. Someone was walking around directly above her apartment. She stood up abruptly and walked to the stairs that led to the second floor. When she reached the top, she realized that the noise had stopped. She peered down the dimly lit hallway and saw nothing. She turned the lights on, hoping to catch whoever was making the noise, but the coast was clear. She went back to her apartment and tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. But as soon as she closed the door, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She had a sneaking suspicion that she wasn't alone in the building. She considered calling the police, but decided against it. She didn't want to seem paranoid, and she couldn't prove that anything had happened, so she did the only thing she could do. She locked her door, drew the curtains, and tried to relax. As the hours passed, she started to calm down. She told herself that she was being silly. It was just an old building settling. But then the floorboards started creaking again. This time, it was coming from the apartment above hers. She listened intently. Yes, someone was definitely walking around on the floor above her. Curiosity got the better of her, and she got in her car to drive to the store. But as she was pulling out of her parking space, she noticed something odd. A pair of eyes seemed to be staring at her from the window of the apartment across the hall. She slammed on the brakes, heart racing. Was she really seeing what she thought she was seeing? Had her neighbor been watching her come and go? Or was it something else entirely? She couldn't be sure. She sat there frozen, trying to make sense of what she had seen. But the longer she stared, the more the image of those piercing eyes burned into her mind. And when she finally pulled out of her parking space, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her every move. As she drove to the store, she couldn't help but feel on edge. Every time she stopped at a red light, she scanned the faces of the people around her, half expecting to see the same pair of eyes that had unnerved her. But of course, she didn't see them. She reached the store and quickly got out of her car, eager to put some distance between her and the eerie eyes that had followed her. As she walked inside, she tried to focus on her shopping list, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She started to imagine that the people around her were part of a conspiracy, all working together to keep tabs on her every move. She began to feel claustrophobic, as if she couldn't escape the watchful eyes that seemed to be following her everywhere she went. She needed to get out of there. She quickly finished checking out and rushed back to her car. But as she got in, she noticed a small note that had been slipped under her windshield wiper. She opened it cautiously, unsure of what she might find. The note simply said, "Don't trust anyone." Her heart skipped a beat. Was this some kind of sick joke or something more sinister? Who would do this, and why? She crumpled up the note and threw it away, trying to convince herself that it was nothing but a prank. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She locked her car and hurried inside. The flickering shadows on the walls seemed to dance ominously, mocking her growing paranoia. Every creak of the floorboard sent shivers down her spine, and the scratching sounds coming from the vents made her jump. Each tick-tock of the clock echoed in the silence, amplifying her fear. Then she heard it again, the scratching, but this time it was coming from inside her apartment. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she made her way toward the source of the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. She found the culprit behind the scratching, a small mouse scampering across the floor. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she watched the mouse disappear into a hole in the corner, she noticed something strange. The hole was new, hadn't been there before, and it seemed to be watching her, its beady eyes gleaming in the darkness. She tried to ignore it, but the hole grew larger, becoming a gaping maw that seemed to consume everything in its path. She tried to cover it with a blanket, but the scratching started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. The scratching continued long after she had fled the apartment, echoing in her ears like a haunting lullaby. She wandered aimlessly, desperate to escape the suffocating feeling of being watched. But no matter where she went, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. One day, she decided to confront her fears and moved into the apartment next door. At first, everything seemed fine. The sun streamed through the windows and the birds sang merrily outside. But as the day wore on, the shadows grew longer and the temperature dropped. She started to feel the familiar sensation of being watched. She could have sworn she heard the scratching again, but she dismissed it as her imagination. But then the scratching started again. Louder now, more insistent. She couldn't take it anymore. She ran to the window and looked out into the darkness, but all she saw were the shadowy figures of trees swaying in the wind. But she knew she wasn't alone. She could feel it in her bones. As the night wore on, the scratching grew louder and more frenzied. She paced her apartment, unable to find solace anywhere. Then suddenly, there was a crash from the apartment above her. She froze. Had she imagined it? Was she losing her mind? The crash came again, followed by a low growl that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. She couldn't stand it any longer. She grabbed her keys and fled into the night, not daring to look back. She drove around aimlessly for hours, the growl echoing in her ears. As the sun began to rise, she slowly made her way back home. With each step, she felt a growing sense of dread. The growl was still there, louder than ever. She stumbled inside and collapsed on the floor. She was safe, she told herself. But as the growling grew louder, she knew she wasn't. She huddled in the corner, shivering as the growling reached a fever pitch. Suddenly, the door burst open and she screamed. Standing in the doorway was a wild-eyed man covered in scratches. He lunged towards her and she closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. But instead of pain, she felt a searing heat. She opened her eyes to see the man engulfed in flames. The fire spread quickly, consuming him and the apartment in its path. She ran for the hills, screaming for help. As the fire raged behind her, she knew she had escaped the clutches of her stalker, but she couldn't help but wonder who he was and why he had chosen her. She had moved to a new city, determined to start a fresh new life. But it seemed that her stalker had followed her, driven by an obsession that had ultimately consumed him. She hoped that by sharing her story, other women would be aware of the dangers of obsessive stalkers and the importance of trusting their instincts when something doesn't feel right.